What would you do if you discovered your trusted caretaker had killed 3 elderly women before you? Would you call the police? Would you run? Would you confront him? Well, when I found those burial site photos hidden in his room, I chose a fourth option. I decided to give Marcus exactly what he'd been planning to give me. My name is Betty Harrison, and I'm 73 years old. Everyone in Millbrook knows me as the quiet widow who tends her garden and bakes cookies for the church social. They see this old woman with silver hair and think they know my whole story. But honey, if they only knew what these weathered hands were capable of when pushed too far. It started 6 months ago when I placed that ad in the local paper. Elderly woman seeks live-in caretaker. Lighthouse work, companionship, fair wages. After my Harold passed, this big house felt like a tomb. The silence was so thick I could taste it, heavy as molasses on my tongue. I thought I needed help. Someone to ease the loneliness that was eating me alive from the inside out. Marcus answered my ad on a Tuesday morning in October. When he knocked on my screen door, I was making apple butter, and the kitchen smelled like cinnamon and home. He was clean cut, maybe 25 with sandy brown hair and the kind of smile that reminded me of my grandson before the accident took him. His clothes were neat but not expensive, and he had this way of looking right at you when he talked, like you were the most important person in the world. Mrs. Harrison? His voice was warm honey over fresh biscuits. I'm Marcus Coleman. I saw your advertisement, and I'd like to help you if you'll have me. The way he said it, so respectful and gentle, made something loosen in my chest that had been tight since Harold's funeral. I invited him in for coffee and questioning. He told me he'd grown up on a farm in Kentucky, knew his way around household repairs and cooking, said his grandmother had raised him after his parents died in a car crash when he was 12. The pain in his eyes when he talked about losing family seemed genuine, raw in a way that spoke to my own grief. He had references too, though I was too trusting to call them all proper like. I don't need much, ma'am, he said, stirring sugar into his coffee with careful motions. Just a place to stay and enough to save up for my own place someday. I believe in taking care of people who need caring for. My grandmother always said it was the Christian thing to do. Lord forgive me, but I hired him on the spot. The sweet boy, with his easy manners and respectful ways, seemed like an answer to prayers. I'd been too proud to pray out loud. I showed him to the guest room upstairs, the one that used to be Harold's study, and watched him settle in like he belonged there. For the first month, Marcus was everything I could have asked for. He fixed the leaky faucet in the kitchen that had been dripping since spring. He cleaned the gutters without me having to ask, and organized Harold's tools in the garage with the kind of care that showed respect for a dead man's possessions. In the evenings, we'd sit on the front porch and he'd tell me stories about his childhood, about catching fireflies in mason jars and helping his grandmother with her vegetable garden. But there were small things, tiny as pinpricks, that should have warned me. The way he watched me when he thought I wasn't looking, studying my movements like he was memorizing them. How he'd ask casual questions about my routine, about who visited, about whether I had family that checked on me regular. I told myself it was just natural curiosity, maybe even concern for my safety. The questions got more specific as time went on. He wanted to know about my medications, about my sleeping habits, about the layout of the house late at night. When I mentioned that I took a sleeping pill when my arthritis was acting up, he seemed particularly interested, asked what kind, how strong, whether they made me sleep deep. I thought he was just trying to be helpful, making sure he knew how to care for me properly. Marcus started volunteering for errands. I hadn't asked him to do. He'd insist on going to the pharmacy, or pick up my prescriptions, saying it wasn't safe for an elderly woman to be driving all over town. He'd handle my grocery shopping, claiming he enjoyed getting out and meeting people. Before I knew it, he was managing most of my contact with the outside world, always with such thoughtful explanations that I felt grateful rather than suspicious. It was around the 3rd month that I started noticing changes in myself. I was sleeping more during the day, feeling foggy and confused in ways that scared me. My appetite had decreased, and I'd catch myself staring at nothing for minutes at a time. When I mentioned these symptoms to Marcus, he'd nod sympathetically and suggest I might be coming down with something. Maybe I should rest more, let him handle the household responsibilities while I recovered. Don't you worry about a thing, Mrs. Betty, he'd say, using the pet name that had started feeling more patronizing than affectionate. I'll take care of everything. You just focus on getting your strength back. But then something happened that changed everything. I was dusting in his room while he was out getting supplies, something I'd done dozens of times before. Marcus always kept his space neat as a pin, and I rarely found anything out of place. But that day, as I was moving his laptop to clean the desk underneath, a manila folder slipped from between some books and fell to the floor, spilling its contents across my clean hardwood. What I saw made my knees give out completely. I sank to the floor among scattered photographs and newspaper clippings, my hands shaking so badly I could barely pick them up. There were pictures of burial sites, shallow graves marked with small stones, police reports about missing elderly women, and most terrifying of all, photographs of 3 different houses with notes scribbled in Marcus's careful handwriting. Mrs. Eleanor Vaughn, 69, found dead at bottom of stairs after accidental fall. No signs of foul play. Mrs. Dorothy Kent, 71, died peacefully in her sleep of apparent heart failure. Caretaker discovered body the following morning. Mrs. Rose Martinez, 74, succumbed to complications from pneumonia. Live-in companion provided excellent care until the end. Each clipping was accompanied by photographs, not the kind you'd see in a newspaper, but personal shots taken from inside these women's homes. Pictures that showed the layout, the stairs, the bedrooms where they died. Pictures that could only have been taken by someone who had access, someone who had been trusted. But it was the 4th set of photos that made my blood turn to ice water in my veins. They were pictures of my house, my front porch, my bedroom window, my kitchen, where I'd first served him coffee 6 months ago, and written across the bottom in that same careful script, Betty Harrison, timeline, 6-8 months, method, accidental fall or medication overdose. I was looking at my own death certificate, written in advance by the monster I'd invited into my home. As I sat there on the floor of what I thought was my guest room, surrounded by evidence of Marcus's previous kills, the pieces of my nightmare began falling into place like dominoes. Each revelation hit harder than the last, painting a picture so evil I could barely comprehend it. The inheritance documents were the most chilling part. Marcus hadn't just killed these women for sport, or some twisted psychological pleasure. He'd been systematically inheriting their property, their savings, their entire life's work. Miss Eleanor Vaughn had left him her house and $47,000 in savings, after knowing him for only 4 months. Mrs. Dorothy Kent had signed over her car and opened a joint bank account with him just weeks before her natural death. Mrs. Rose Martinez had actually legally adopted him as her grandson, leaving him everything she owned. But here's what made my blood run colder than a January morning. Marcus had legal documents already prepared for me too. Adoption papers naming him as my heir ready for my signature. A new will that would leave him my house, my savings, Harold's life insurance money. Everything I'd spent 73 years accumulating, all the paperwork was filled out, just waiting for the right moment to present it to a confused, medicated old woman who thought she was doing something kind for the sweet boy who'd been caring for her. The medication logs were what really broke my heart, though. Marcus had been keeping detailed records of what he'd been giving me, careful notes about dosages and effects. Those sleeping pills that made me so groggy weren't the same ones Dr. Morrison had prescribed. Marcus had been switching them out, giving me something stronger, something that would make me compliant and confused. The appetite loss, the mental fog, the way I'd been feeling so weak and disoriented. It was all part of his plan to make me dependent on him, while slowly poisoning my system. I found receipts for medications I'd never seen, purchased under false names from different pharmacies around the county. Anti-anxiety drugs that could cause confusion in elderly patients. Blood pressure medications that could simulate a heart attack when given to someone who didn't need them. Even insulin, which could kill a diabetic or non-diabetic alike if administered incorrectly. There was a timeline, written in his neat handwriting, like a business plan for murder. Week 1-4, establish trust and routine. Week 5-12, begin medication substitution. Isolate from community. Week 13-20, introduce legal documents, increase dependency. Week 21-24, finalize inheritance papers, prepare for termination. Week 25, eliminate subject, inherit assets, move to next location. I was currently in week 23 of Marcus's timeline. According to his schedule, I had maybe 2 weeks left to live. But the most terrifying discovery was hidden in a small notebook tucked behind everything else. It contained names and addresses of potential future targets, elderly women across 3 states who lived alone, who had assets worth inheriting, who'd recently lost spouses and might be vulnerable to a charming young man's attention. My name had been on that list for over a year before Marcus had ever knocked on my door. He'd been watching me, studying me, learning my habits and my weaknesses long before I'd placed that advertisement. There were photos of me I'd never known were taken. Me working in my garden, me at the grocery store, me sitting on my front porch reading the newspaper. He'd been stalking me like prey, waiting for the right moment to make his approach seem like a coincidence, rather than a calculated attack. That's when I heard his truck pulling into the driveway. The familiar rumble of the engine that had once sounded comforting but now sent terror shooting through my veins like lightning. I had maybe 3 minutes before Marcus would be inside, expecting to find me napping in my chair like the docile old woman he thought he'd created. My hands were shaking as I tried to gather up all the evidence, to put everything back exactly as I'd found it. But there was so much, and my arthritic fingers weren't cooperating. I could hear his boots on the front porch steps, hear his keys jangling as he searched for the right one. I managed to stuff most of the papers back into the folder and slide it between the books where I'd found it. But one photograph slipped out and skittered under his bed, where I couldn't reach it. It was a picture of Mrs. Rose Martinez in her coffin, taken at what must have been her funeral. Written on the back in Marcus's handwriting was a single word: complete. His key turned in the front door lock just as I was straightening up, my heart hammering so hard I was sure he'd hear it from downstairs. I grabbed my dust cloth and tried to look busy, tried to appear like the same confused, trusting old woman he'd left that morning. "Mrs. Betty," his voice called from downstairs, warm and cheerful as always. "I'm back from the hardware store. How are you feeling today?" "Just fine, dear," I managed to call back, proud that my voice sounded normal despite the terror clawing at my insides. "I was just doing a little cleaning up here." I heard his footsteps on the stairs, that familiar sound that had once seemed comforting, but now felt like a countdown. Countdown my execution. As he appeared in the doorway of his room, I was dusting his nightstand with what I hoped looked like innocent efficiency. "You don't need to clean my room, Mrs. Betty," he said, and for the first time I noticed something different in his tone. Not quite suspicious, but more alert somehow, like a predator that had caught an unfamiliar scent. "I can take care of my own space. You should be resting, saving your strength." "Oh, I know, sweetheart," I replied, playing the role of the dotty old woman he expected. But I was just feeling so much better today. Thought I'd get caught up on the housework. "Dr. Morrison always says staying active is good for folks my age." Marcus nodded, but his eyes were scanning the room, taking inventory of his possessions. I held my breath, praying he wouldn't notice anything out of place, wouldn't see the corner of that photograph peeking out from under his bed. "That's wonderful that you're feeling stronger," he said, moving closer to me, close enough that I could smell his cologne mixed with something else. Something sharp and medicinal, that I now understood, came from handling all those illegal drugs. "In fact, I picked up your new prescription while I was out. Dr. Morrison said, these might help with your sleeping better." He pulled a small orange bottle from his pocket, the kind pharmacies use for controlled substances. But the label looked different from my usual prescriptions, and when I reached for it, he pulled it back slightly. "Now these are a bit stronger than what you've been taking," he said, his smile never wavering, but his grip on the bottle tightening. "The doctor wants you to be very careful with the dosage. Just 1 pill tonight, and only when I'm here to keep an eye on you. We wouldn't want you to get confused and take too many by accident." The way he said accident made my skin crawl, because now I understood that there were no accidents in Marcus's world. Only carefully orchestrated deaths designed to look natural. "Of course, dear," I said, accepting the bottle with hands I forced to remain steady. "You know I trust your judgment completely. You've been taking such good care of me." But as I said those words, I was thinking about that photograph under his bed, about the 3 women who had trusted him just as completely, and I was making a decision that would have terrified the woman I'd been that morning. Before I'd discovered what kind of monster was living in my guest room. I wasn't going to be victim number 4. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the orange pill bottle Marcus had given me, and made the most important decision of my life. I wasn't going to take those pills. More importantly, I wasn't going to let him know I wasn't taking them. For the first time in months, my mind felt crystal clear. The fog that had been clouding my thoughts was lifting, and I realized it was because Marcus hadn't been able to slip me his special cocktail of drugs at lunchtime like he usually did. He'd been too busy with his errands, and I'd prepared my own meal for the first time in weeks. The woman sitting in that chair wasn't the confused, dependent elderly lady Marcus thought he'd created. She was Belly Harrison, who'd helped her husband Harold run a successful construction business for 30 years, who'd managed payroll, dealt with difficult customers, and handled the books when money was tight, who'd raised 2 children and buried both of them, along with her husband, and still found the strength to keep going. Marcus had made the fatal error of underestimating what a woman would do when she realized she was fighting for her life. I spent that night planning while he slept peacefully in the room next door, probably dreaming about inheriting my house. The first thing I did was search online using Harold's old computer, learning everything I could about Marcus Coleman. What I found confirmed my worst fears and gave me the ammunition I needed. Marcus Coleman didn't exist before 5 years ago. No birth certificate, no school records, no family history that I could trace. He'd invented himself, created a fake identity to cover tracks that stretched back over a decade, but the internet never forgets. And if you know how to look, even an old woman can find evidence of evil. I found news reports about suspicious deaths in elderly care facilities where a man matching Marcus's description had worked. Always a different name. Always spotless references. Always moving on just after another mysterious natural death. The pattern was clear once you knew to look for it, but individual police departments had never connected the dots across state lines. But then I found something that gave me hope. In Tennessee, a woman named Martha Kellerman had survived. She'd been found unconscious in her home after what appeared to be an accidental overdose, but she'd recovered and told police that her live-in caretaker had tried to kill her. The man had disappeared before police arrived, but Martha had provided a detailed description that matched Marcus perfectly. Martha was still alive, living with her daughter in Nashville, and according to the phone book, she had a listed number. I called her at 6 a.m, when I knew Marcus would still be asleep. Martha's voice was strong and clear, nothing like the confused victim Marcus would have expected. "I've been waiting for this call for 2 years, she said after I'd explained who I was and why I was calling. I knew he'd surface again somewhere. These predators, they can't stop themselves. It's like a hunger that never gets satisfied." Martha told me about her experience with the man who'd called himself David Morrison, how he'd gained her trust over months, isolated her from friends and family, started medicating her into compliance. But Martha had gotten suspicious when she found a jewelry store receipt in his jacket pocket for her grandmother's engagement ring, a ring that was supposed to be locked safely in her bedroom safe. "That's when I started pretending to take the pills he gave me," she explained. "I dyed them under my tongue, then spit them out when he wasn't looking. It took weeks for my head to clear enough to realize what he was really doing to me." Martha had set a trap, pretending to be sicker than she was, making the man who called himself David think his timeline could be accelerated. When he'd given her what he thought was a fatal dose of medication, Martha had taken just enough to appear unconscious, but not enough to actually die. Her daughter, who Martha had secretly contacted, had arrived with police just as David was staging the scene to look like a suicide. "The key," Martha told me, "is making him think he's still in control while you gather evidence. These men, they're arrogant. They think elderly women are too stupid and weak to fight back. Use that against him." She gave me practical advice about documenting everything, about creating backup plans, about staying alive long enough to see justice done. Most importantly, she gave me the phone number for Detective Sarah Rodriguez in Nashville, the one person in law enforcement who understood the pattern and was actively investigating similar cases across multiple states. Detective Rodriguez was everything I'd hoped for and more. She listened to my story without skepticism, asked detailed questions about Marcus's methods, and promised to start building a case immediately. But she also warned me about the danger I was in. "These predators escalate when they feel threatened," she said. "If he suspects you know the truth, he might abandon his timeline and act immediately. You need to be very careful, Mrs. Harrison. Can you get out of the house? Stay with relatives until we can arrest him." But I didn't have relatives to stay with, and running would just mean Marcus would disappear and find another victim. I'd looked at his list of potential targets, and I couldn't live with knowing I'd condemned another woman to the fate he'd planned for me. I'm staying, I told Detective Rodriguez. But I'm not going down without a fight. That's when she told me about the recording equipment. Small digital devices that could capture audio without being detected. If I could get Marcus to admit what he'd done, to talk about his plans for me or his previous victims, it would give police the evidence they needed for a conviction that would stick. The devices arrived 2 days later, delivered by what appeared to be a flower delivery service, but was actually an undercover Oprah operation. Marcus was out running errands, giving me just enough time to hide the recording equipment in strategic locations around the house. But the most important thing Detective Rodriguez had told me was about the timing. Marcus was a creature of habit, following the same pattern with each victim. If I was in week 23 of his timeline, I had maybe 10 days before he would make his final move. 10 days to gather enough evidence to ensure he never hurt anyone else again. The next few days were the most terrifying of my life. I had to maintain the pretense of being the fugue, medicated old woman while secretly staying alert and gathering evidence. I had to take just enough of his pills to appear compliant without actually ingesting the full doses that would make me vulnerable. I had to act grateful for his care while knowing he was planning my death. Marcus started making more phone calls in the evenings, always stepping outside or going to his room when he thought I was asleep. But I was listening, recording, documenting every conversation I could capture. I heard him talking to someone about accelerating the timeline, about a buyer who was interested in my property and wanted to move quickly. I heard him discussing medication dosages with what sounded like a medical professional, though I suspected it was actually someone else in his network of predators. Most chillingly, I heard him describing my house to someone, giving detailed information about the layout and the best way to stage an accidental fall down the front stairs. It happened on a Tuesday night, exactly 24 days after I'd first discovered those photographs in his room. I'd been playing the role of the declining elderly woman while secretly staying sharp and gathering evidence. But Marcus had started watching me more carefully. I could feel his eyes on me during meals, could sense him testing my reactions to see how confused I really was. That morning, he'd brought me my medication with more insistence than usual, standing over me while I supposedly swallowed the pills and even asking me to open my mouth afterward to make sure I'd taken them. I'd gotten good at hiding pills under my tongue, but his scrutiny was making me nervous. If he figured out I wasn't as medicated as he thought, he might abandon his careful timeline and act immediately. After lunch, Marcus announced he was going into town to run some errands that might take several hours. But something about the way he said it, the way he watched my face for reactions, made me suspicious. I had the feeling this was some kind of test, that he wasn't really leaving at all. So instead of immediately starting my usual evidence-gathering activities, I sat in my living room chair and pretended to doze like the heavily medicated woman he expected me to be. And sure enough, about an hour after his truck had pulled out of the driveway, I heard the soft click of the back door opening. Marcus had circled back, parking somewhere out of sight, and sneaking into his own house to spy on me. He was testing whether I was really as compliant and confused as I appeared, or if I might be more aware than he'd calculated. I kept my eyes closed and my breathing steady as I heard his footsteps moving carefully through the house. He spent several minutes in his room, probably checking to see if anything had been disturbed. Then he moved to the kitchen, and I heard the soft sound of him going through my pill bottles, checking to see if the quantities matched what I should have taken. The refrigerator door opened and closed. Cabinet drawers slid open quietly. He was conducting a thorough investigation of my daily activity, while he thought I was unconscious. If I'd been up and about, gathering evidence or trying to contact the outside world, he would have found signs of it. After nearly an hour of this surveillance, I heard him leave through the back door again. His truck started up somewhere down the road, and he drove back to the house with all the noise and fanfare of someone returning from town, calling out his cheerful greeting as he came through the front door. "Mrs. Betty, I'm back from my errands. How are you feeling this afternoon?" I made a show of stirring in my chair, blinking slowly like someone waking up from a drug-induced deuce. "Oh, Marcus dear. I must have dozed off. Did you have a good trip to town?" He studied my face carefully, and I could see him analyzing my responses, looking for any sign that I might be more alert than I appeared. "Yes, ma'am, very productive. I picked up some things we'll need for this evening." The way he said "this evening" sent ice water through my veins. There was something different about his tone, something final and determined, that told me his timeline had changed. Tonight wasn't going to be just another day of slow poisoning and gradual decline. Tonight was going to be the night Marcus Coleman tried to kill me. That's wonderful, dear, I said, maintaining the performance of my life. I'm feeling a bit tired still. Maybe I'll rest a little more before dinner. Actually, Mrs. Betty, I was hoping we could have a little talk first, Marcus said, settling into the chair across from me. About your future, about some arrangements I think we should make. He pulled out a manila folder that looked official and important, the kind lawyers use for estate planning documents. My heart started pounding, but I kept my expression mildly curious, like an elderly woman who trusted her caretaker completely. You know I care about you very much, Marcus continued, his voice taking on that warm, manipulative tone I'd learned to recognize and hate. And I've been thinking about what would happen to you if something were to happen to me. You're so dependent on my care now, and if I had to leave suddenly, you'd be all alone again. He opened the folder and pulled out papers that I recognized from my secret investigation, the adoption documents that would make him legally my heir, the will that would leave him everything I owned, the power of attorney forms that would give him control over my finances and medical decisions. I think it would give us both peace of mind, he said, pulling out a pen with a flourish, if we made our relationship more official. I've talked to a lawyer about the possibility of you adopting me as your grandson. That way, I could take care of you legally, and you'd never have to worry about being alone or unprotected. The pen gleamed in his hand like a weapon. Because that's exactly what it was. My signature on those documents would be signing my death warrant, giving Marcus legal cover for everything he planned to do to me. Oh my, I said, trying to sound overwhelmed and touched by his thoughtfulness. That's so kind of you to think of, Marcus. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything right now, he replied, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. Just sign here, and we can make it all official. Then you'll never have to worry about anything again. The way he said never have to worry about anything again was like a death knell, because he was right. Dead people don't worry about anything. But here's what Marcus didn't know about me. During my 30 years helping Harold with his construction business, I learned to read contracts and legal documents. I dealt with lawyers and real estate agents and insurance adjusters. I might be a 73-year-old widow, but I wasn't the confused, helpless victim he'd been conditioning me to become. This is so overwhelming, I said, taking the papers with hands I made sure to shake just slightly. Could you explain exactly what each of these documents does? I want to make sure I understand what I'm signing. For just a moment, Marcus's mask slipped. I saw irritation flash across his features, annoyance that his elderly victim was asking questions instead of just signing obediently. But he recovered quickly, putting his practiced smile back in place. Of course, Mrs. Betty. This first one legally makes me your adopted grandson, which means I can make medical and financial decisions if you become unable to. This second one updates your will to leave your estate to me, since I'll be your legal heir. And this last one gives me power of attorney, so I can handle your affairs if you become too confused to manage them yourself. Each word was a nail in what he intended to be my coffin, but I nodded along like the trusting old woman he expected, even as my mind raced through the implications of what he was asking me to sign. That all sounds very responsible, I said, but I'm feeling a bit lightheaded right now. Could we maybe do this tomorrow morning when my head is clearer? The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Marcus's smile became strained, and I could see him cackling whether to push harder or maintain his patient facade for one more day. Actually, Mrs. Betty, I think it would be better to handle this tonight, he said. There was steel underneath the honey now. I have to drive to Louisville tomorrow to take care of some family business, and I'd hate to leave you without these protections in place. What if something happened while I was gone? That's when I knew for certain that tonight was the night Marcus had planned to kill me. The trip to Louisville was probably fictional. Just like everything else about him, he wanted these documents signed tonight, because he intended for me to die tonight, and he needed the legal paperwork in place to inherit my property without questions. You're absolutely right, dear, I said, reaching for the pen with a hand that trembled just enough to seem authentic. Let me just put on my reading glasses so I can see where to sign. I could feel Marcus's anticipation as I fumbled with my glasses case, taking longer than necessary to find my spectacles. He thought he was watching a confused old woman struggling with simple tasks, but what he was actually seeing was me buying time while I prepared for the most important performance of my life. Because what Marcus Coleman didn't know as he sat there in my living room preparing to watch me sign my own death warrant was that every word of our conversation was being recorded by equipment hidden throughout my house. Detective Rodriguez and her team weren't in Nashville anymore. They were stationed less than a mile away, waiting for my signal. But more importantly, Marcus didn't know that the confused, helpless elderly woman he thought he'd created over the past 6 months had never really existed at all. She'd been an act, a role I'd been playing to stay alive long enough to gather the evidence that would put him away forever. And tonight, Marcus Coleman was about to learn exactly what kind of mistake he'd made when he chose Betty Harrison as his next victim. I held that pen in my trembling hand and looked up at Marcus with what I hoped appeared to be grateful, trusting eyes. You know, Marcus, before I sign these important papers, I'd love to hear more about your other families. The other elderly ladies you've helped like this. Something flickered across his face. Surprise, caution, maybe the first hint that this conversation wasn't going exactly as he'd planned. I'm not sure what you mean, Mrs. Betty. You're the first lady I've cared for in this way. Oh, but that's not quite right, is it? I said, my voice still soft and confused, but carrying just a thread of something sharper. What about Mrs. Eleanor Vaughn? I found such a lovely obituary for her online. It mentioned how devoted her caretaker was right up until her accidental fall. The change in Marcus was immediate and terrifying. The warm mask he'd worn for 6 months dropped away completely, revealing something cold and calculating underneath. His hand moved toward the pen in my grasp, but I pulled it back slightly. And Mrs. Dorothy Kent, I continued, as if I were discussing the weather instead of exposing a serial killer. Heart failure is so common in women her age, though I thought it was interesting that her caretaker inherited her car and savings account. Mrs. Betty, Marcus said, and his voice had gone flat and dangerous. I think you're getting confused again. Maybe we should get you some of your medication before we finish this paperwork. But I wasn't finished. Then there was Mrs. Rose Martinez. Such a tragedy. Pneumonia at her age. But how wonderful that she was able to legally adopt her caretaker before she passed. Just like you're asking me to do tonight. Marcus stood up from his chair, and for the first time since I'd known him, he looked truly menacing. The gentle young man facade had crumbled completely, leaving behind a predator who'd been caught mid-hunt. You've been going through my things, he said, and it wasn't a question anymore. How long have you known? About 3 weeks, I replied, setting the unsigned papers down on my lap. Ever since I found your photo collection. Very thorough documentation, Marcus. Though I have to say, your filing system could use some work. He moved closer, and I could see him calculating distances, probably wondering if he could overpower me before I could call for help. But what Marcus still didn't understand was that help was already here. The thing is, Marcus, I said, my voice growing stronger with each word, I stopped being a victim the moment I found those photographs. Did you really think a woman who survived the Great Depression, raised 2 children, and ran a business for 30 years, would just roll over and die for a punk like you? His face went pale as he finally heard the real Betty Harrison speaking. Not the confused old woman he'd been poisoning and manipulating, but the sharp-minded survivor who'd been playing him for weeks. You've made a lot of mistakes, son, I continued, standing up from my chair with more strength than I'd shown in months. First mistake was underestimating me. Second mistake was keeping such detailed records of your murders. Third mistake was thinking I wouldn't find them. You can't prove anything, Marcus said, but his voice was shaking now. Who's going to believe a confused old woman over what? A serial killer who's been drugging me for months. A predator who's murdered at least 3 elderly women for their money. I pulled out my cell phone. The one I'd told him was too complicated for me to understand. Detective Rodriguez. I think we've heard enough, don't you? The voice that came from my phone's speaker was clear and professional. More than enough, Mrs. Harrison. We've got everything recorded. Marcus Coleman, you're under arrest. That's when the front door burst open and Detective Rodriguez entered with 2 uniformed officers, weapons drawn and ready. Marcus spun around like a trapped animal, his eyes darting between the officers and me, probably calculating whether he could fight or run. Don't even think about it, Detective Rodriguez said calmly. We've got the house surrounded. We've been listening to your confession for the past 10 minutes. You're done hurting people. As the officers cuffed Marcus and read him his rights, he looked back at me with pure hatred in his eyes. You stupid old bitch, he snarled. You think you've won something here? I think I've saved lives, I replied, including my own. And honey, This stupid old bitch just outsmarted you at every turn. The search of Marcus's room revealed even more evidence than I'd found in my initial discovery. Hidden in a false bottom of his suitcase were driver's licenses and social security cards belonging to his previous victims. Bank statements showing systematic theft of their assets, even jewelry that had belonged to the women he'd murdered, kept as sick trophies of his crimes. But the most important evidence was the detailed journal he'd been keeping, documenting not just his methods, but his feelings about each killing. The investigators said it would be crucial in linking him to unsolved cases across multiple states. Detective Rodriguez later told me that Marcus had confessed to 11 murders over a 7-year period, all elderly women living alone who'd been targeted for their assets. My case had provided the breakthrough they needed to connect crimes that had been scattered across different jurisdictions. The trial took 8 months, and I testified for 3 hours about my experience. Marcus's defense attorney tried to paint me as a vindictive old woman making up stories, but the evidence was overwhelming: the recordings, the photographs, the inherited assets from previous victims, his own detailed journals. It all painted a picture of a methodical killer who'd made a career out of murdering vulnerable elderly women. Marcus Coleman was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. At his sentencing hearing, I was allowed to make a victim impact statement. "Your Honor," I said, looking directly at Marcus for the last time. "This man thought he could prey on elderly women because he believed we were helpless and forgotten. He was wrong. We are mothers, daughters, survivors who've lived through more than he could imagine. We deserve to live our final years with dignity and peace, not as victims of predators who see our age as weakness." Marcus was led away in shackles, and I never saw him again. 6 months after Marcus's conviction, I was sitting in my garden on a warm spring morning, tending to the tomatoes that Harold and I had planted together 40 years ago. The same hands that had once trembled with fear while hiding evidence of a serial killer's crimes were now steady and strong, working the soil with renewed purpose. The house felt different now, not haunted by Marcus's presence, but cleansed by the truth that had finally come to light. I'd had the guest room completely renovated, turning it from the space where a monster had lived into a bright office where I now worked on something that had become my mission. Detective Rodriguez had connected me with other survivors of similar predators, women who'd escaped or fought back against caregivers who'd tried to steal not just their assets, but their lives. Together, we'd formed a network to help elderly people identify and avoid these kinds of scams, and to support victims who'd been targeted by criminals masquerading as helpers. The Betty Harrison Foundation, as we'd named it, provided resources for background checking, caregivers, emergency response systems for ISUTL elderly people, and legal assistance for those who'd been victimized by financial predators. We'd already helped prevent 3 similar cases in neighboring states, and our educational materials were being distributed through senior centers across the region. But perhaps more importantly, I discovered that surviving Marcus's attempts to kill me had given me something I hadn't expected: a renewed sense of purpose and strength that made me feel more alive than I had in years. Martha Kellerman, the woman from Tennessee who'd helped me understand how to fight back, had become a close friend. We talked every week, sharing strategies for staying safe and supporting other elderly women who found themselves in dangerous situations. "You know what the most important thing is," Martha told me during one of our conversations, "is that we didn't just survive. We fought back. We refused to be victims, and we made sure these predators couldn't hurt anyone else." She was right. The scared, isolated woman who'd hired Marcus 6 months ago had been transformed by the experience of fighting for her life. I was still 73 years old, still a widow living alone in a big house, but I was no longer vulnerable prey for those who saw elderly women as easy targets. The physical effects of Marcus's poisoning had taken months to fully clear from my system. Dr. Musin had been horrified when Detective Rodriguez explained what had been done to me, and he'd overseen a careful detox process to eliminate the various drugs Marcus had been slipping into my food and medication. The mental fog, the weakness, the confusion, all of it had been artificially induced by a predator who wanted me compliant and helpless. Getting my strength and clarity back had been like waking up from a nightmare to find the sun shining. I'd also made changes to protect myself and other elderly people in my community. The spare bedroom was now equipped with a panic room setup, reinforced locks, a separate phone line, and emergency supplies in case anyone ever tried to trap me in my own home again. I'd installed security cameras and motion sensors, and I joined a daily check-in network with other elderly neighbors. But the most important change was in how I saw myself. I was no longer just an elderly widow, waiting for the end of her story. I was a survivor, an advocate, and a woman with important work still to do. The local newspaper had run a series of articles about my case, and I'd been invited to speak at senior centers and community groups about recognizing and preventing elder abuse. At first, public speaking had terrified me, but I discovered that sharing my story was both healing for me and potentially life-saving for others. The thing about predators, I would tell my audiences, is that they count on us feeling ashamed or helpless. They want us to believe we're too old, too confused, or too isolated to fight back. But every woman in this room has survived challenges that would break someone half our age. We've raised families, run households, weathered losses that would crush weaker people. That strength doesn't disappear just because our hair turns gray. The response was always powerful. Women would come up to me afterward with their own stories. Some of narrow escapes from similar predators, others of suspicious caregivers or family members who seemed more interested in their assets than their well-being. One woman, Mrs. Dorothy Chen, told me about a home health aide who'd been pressuring her to sign financial documents and had isolated her from her children by claiming they were only interested in her money. Based on my advice, Mrs. Chen had secretly recorded conversations with the aide and discovered she was part of a larger scam targeting elderly Asian immigrants. The aide and 3 accomplices were arrested before they could steal Mrs. Chen's life savings. Another woman, Mrs. Rosa Martinez, coincidentally sharing a name with one of Marcus's victims, had noticed that her new caretaker was asking detailed questions about her will and had pressured her to change banks. She'd contacted Detective Rodriguez's office based on my story, and the investigation revealed that her caretaker was using stolen identities and had warrant for elder abuse in 2 other states. Each story reinforced what I'd learned from my own experience. These predators were everywhere, and they were counting on elderly people being too isolated, too trusting, or too ashamed to fight back. But we weren't helpless. We were survivors. On this particular spring morning, as I worked in my garden and felt the warm soil between my fingers, I thought about the 3 women Marcus had killed before he came for me. Eleanor Vaughn, Dorothy Kent, and Rose Martinez had trusted him just as completely as I had initially. They'd welcomed him into their homes, grateful for his apparent kindness, never suspecting that his gentle manner hid a killer's heart. I couldn't bring them back, but I could honor their memory by making sure other women didn't suffer the same fate. The tomato plants were thriving, just like Harold and I had taught them to do all those years ago. Strong rows, careful tending, and the patience to let them grow at their own pace. It was a good metaphor for survival, I thought. Sometimes the most beautiful things come from the most careful cultivation. As I worked, I could hear my phone ringing inside the house, probably another call from someone who'd heard my story and needed advice about a suspicious caretaker or family member. I'd answer it, just like I answered all of them now, because that's what survivors do, and we reach back to help pull others out of the darkness we've escaped. Marcus Coleman was serving life in prison, and he would never hurt another elderly woman, but there were other predators out there, other Marcuses waiting to prey on vulnerable people. My job now was to make sure they found it a lot harder to succeed. I brushed the soil from my hands and headed inside to answer the phone, ready to help another woman learn that she was stronger than she knew, braver than she believed, and never too old to fight back. My name is Betty Harrison. I'm 73 years old, and I'm a survivor. And honey, if you ever find yourself in a situation where someone is trying to make you feel helpless or worthless, remember my story. Remember that there's strength in places you never knew existed, and that it's never too late to fight for your life. Because sometimes, the most dangerous person in the room is the one everyone underestimates, and that person just might be you.